folks, David Jamieson here, one half of ConterCast. Kat Boyd will be back very soon. She's just finished her run of wonderful election shows. But today, for my last sort of ConterCast and Friends, if you like, I have two wonderful additions, two members of the Conter editorial board, Sara, Bennett, and Gregor Clunie. Thanks very much for coming on, guys.
An honour to be here.
And we'll be discussing some of the big stories that have been going on. We'll be talking a wee bit about the Scottish elections later, but obviously there's been a lot of stuff happening in the meantime. I'm a bit flustered and a bit sweaty for those of you who are listening and don't have to be subjected to the horror of my slightly kind of pink face after running back here from Kenmure Street in the south side of Glasgow, where a massive protest just stopped the eviction of two men in Pollokshields. Now, Glasgow has a history of preventing these kinds of evictions that have been successful campaigns in the past. But I have to say, this is by far the biggest and most politically radical example of that I've ever seen. By the end of the incident in Kenmure Street, I should probably give you the background. This morning, two men were taken into a van. It's obviously Eid in a very Muslim area. It's obviously something of a provocation, though I have been told that the reason that border police do this on days like Eid and at weddings is because they have a stronger sense of where everyone is on that day. So they obviously knew that, or suspected these men they wanted to pick up would be there because of the Eid celebration. I mean, it's that cynical. However, the van was quickly surrounded. And it has to be said that none of this would have been possible without the work of anti-evictions campaigners and the tenants movement and so on in recent months, because the response was just lightning. It was just straight away. But by the end of the day, the standoff ensued, went on for a long time. There was a very high level of politics. Lots of the local Muslim community. I had one resident making a speech where he said, "We can do Eid later, right? Right now, we need to stop this from happening." And he also said, they're always trying to deport us back to Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq, back to countries that the British state has destroyed. And now the British state wants to deport us back there. So, just speeches on fire, basically. And it ended with the police having to release the two men to, by this point, a crowd of about 1,000 people. The crowd then marched them down to the safety of the local mosque. So the state weren't even able to dictate the terms on which these men were released. They had to release them to the crowd, who said, "Well, we don't trust you. We're going to take him to a sort of place of traditional safety." So an astonishing outcome. I mean, I've not seen something like that in Glasgow in many a year. And the scale of it was just, as I was leaving, it felt like a match day. There were the people just thronging in the streets. There were car cavalcades of young local guys driving their cars and tooting their horns and stuff. I mean, they had taken over the entire area of this movement by the end of the day. So I'm a little bit a little bit blown away by it all. I was not expecting today to be like that. I have to say, it's a very good way to end lockdown. So yeah, that's me sort of exploded all that out there. Sara, you were saying before I came on that you used to live there back in the 90s, did you say? Was it quite a politicized place then?
Yeah, it definitely had a vibe to it. When I was living there, it was 21 years ago. And obviously, as you've mentioned, quite a substantial Muslim community. And it was a community that kind of owned that part of Pollokshields as well, in a very good way, I think. And it was not afraid about being out on the streets. I was talking to you about in the summers, when there'd be cricket tournaments on the telly, you'd get them coming out into the streets and having their own cricket tournaments, obviously with lots of windows nearby, cricket balls flying past as well. But it was really good vibe to it. But in terms of being politicised, I do remember at one point, around the end of the 90s, there was an incident where there'd been attacks by young Muslim men on young white Scottish women. And it was a time when the BNP was quite active around Glasgow as well. And what was really good about it is that the community really came together and kind of owned the problem and said, look, we have to sort this out. All of us together have to sit down and sort it out and take collective responsibility of what's going on and find a solution. Because if we don't, the BNP will be in here. They're already leafleting. All the police are going to get involved, and that's not going to serve anyone's interest. And it was a really useful, it was a big, large meeting that we had with the imam from the local mosque and the community coming out, the teachers, really mixed. And that came about, I think, because you had people on the ground, activists, socialists on the ground who could intervene and pull that together. So that was really important. And I'm hoping that what you've described today is kind of a bit of a legacy of that tradition of we will look after, you know, you said about the two guys getting escorted to the mosque, that taking control of it. This is our problem and we're going to deal with it. I think it's really positive to show what can happen at a community level to deal with issues that might seem completely out of our hands and we can't do anything about it, but actually getting people together, you can really find solutions to these problems. So it's really good news. I was really heartened to see my old street on the news in such a positive way today.
Yeah, it's totally what you just said. It's the difference between, because, you know, with that issue in particular, right? It's obviously become this huge thing in some communities, like with Rotherham and stuff as well, of like, oh, this thing has happened. And I think sometimes it's too easy, especially this is what happened in Rotherham, for local councils and stuff, just to say, well, you know, this is these accusations are, this is just racism or whatever. It's actually a much more democratic and healthy thing to say, look, there's, you know, sexual violence in this community as there is in every community, and it's our responsibility to do something about it. It's very much, I mean, obviously it's a very different situation today, but like the ethos is very much that. The ethos, so the speeches that were being made to the police were very much, I mean, they made the police look like children. You know what I mean? They said things like, come on, why can't we be civilized? There was a guy who got on the megaphone and said, you know, we're peaceful, go back to your stations in peace. What you're doing here is disruptive, it's chaotic, it's violent. You need to go back. We're taking control of this. And it really, I mean, the state looked appalling today. Police Scotland looked appalling today. And every so often they would have this little provocation where they would just try and, you know, they'd get into shoving matches with groups of the protesters who weren't instigating it. And it just looked unbelievably childish. And, you know, it was just, the fact that it was the community itself made such a big difference, because you had people hanging out their windows and shouting, let my neighbour go. That's a difficult thing to argue with, you know, in terms of this idea of community policing. It's a difficult thing to argue with when everyone on the street is telling you that what you're doing is wrong and irresponsible. And I saw, because it was a bit of a car crash for the politicians as well, I saw Nicola Sturgeon saying this has nothing to do with Scotland. This is about the Home Office based in London. Well, of course it is about the Home Office, right? This is about Priti Patel ramping up the so-called, you know, hostile environment. But I'm sorry, 9 in 10 cops that were there today that I could see were Police Scotland. This couldn't have happened without them. There's no way. If this had just been the Home Office police, the border police, this would have been over in minutes, because they would have been totally overwhelmed instantly. This went on all day because, as I counted, 12 Police Scotland riot vans turned up. And by the end of it, I could see, I don't know, maybe a couple of hundred police officers. There were police on horseback. There was a huge deployment of forces today in the south side of Glasgow. That's why this went on all day. It's purely because of Police Scotland. And Police Scotland are very much the tailored police force of the Scottish government. It's very much their project. Gregor, did you see a lot of the stuff on social media?
Yeah, and it was great to see. Really a proud day for Glasgow, I think, and thankfully Glasgow has a really strong record and tradition of opposing immigration raids. And I think for me, this was always a substantial part of my support for Scottish independence was to try and peel back this particularly barbaric facet of the British state, despite being a belligerent imperial or now sub-imperial power, which does make regions of the world unlivable for civilian populations. Britain has a terrible record of welcoming refugees and of responding appropriately and with humanity to asylum applications. And I know that there's a promised overhaul of the system, which was announced in the recent Queen's speech. But certainly under Pretty Patel, you can't see this going in a more progressive direction. I think just fabulous to see that community cohesion and solidarity, and it does give you kind of pride for the city, but also these are the moments where we can build something different, where we can build a power from below. And I think just to get that type of unequivocal win today, where actually these men were unarrested, I think is really meaningful. And that's the type of victory that you can start to build a campaign out of. So no, it was great to see.
Yeah, totally. And like a few days ago, right? I mean, I was looking at the Queen's speech and all the measures in there to crack down on protests and all the, I mean, it had a kind of populist, kind of nationalist sort of tint to it, and that was built into the kind of repressive anti-protest type stuff. And I was just looking at it thinking, God, this is grim. Do you know what I mean? And there's no viable electoral opposition to this. And then you're just reminded a few days later that there are still these popular traditions. You know what I mean? That you can't just get away with whatever you want. That there's like a moral economy. You know what I mean? Like that entire community looked at that and didn't question whether or not the state had the authority to do this. They instantly declared that the state didn't have the authority to do this. And it reminds you, it's not just as simple as, oh, here's a bunch of legislation in the Queen's speech, and this is what we're going to impose. It's not how it works. And as I say, it shows how important though those efforts in building up like those networks in Glasgow have been in recent months. Because I don't assume that the capacity would have been there. There's always been a response to this sort of stuff in Glasgow, but the capacity on display today was of a different order. And it was great that like trade union branches and all that kind of showed up throughout the day. It just showed there was a real, and I remember when I watching that huge rally at the end, people around the mosque, I thought, if this had gone on for another hour, there would have been 2,000 people here. Like it had that explosive escalating feel to it, which is pretty sure why Police Scotland decided to release them, because they thought otherwise we're going to end up with a riot on our hands that we just can't control. And as I was walking away at the end, there was a huge Palestine flag flying over Kenmure Street. And I was shocked by just how much people were drawing the things together. And that wasn't coming from some organized, lefty renter mobs that you sometimes hear about. Those links were actually being made organically by the people who lived there. There's a lot of awareness of what's happening in Palestine. And as that guy who was on the megaphone was saying, these things are linked. If there are refugees in the city, it's largely because they've come from places like Palestine, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, that have been mauled by Western foreign policy. So there was a very clear kind of drawing those two things together. And there were some beautiful images today, but there's also some tragic ones still coming out of Palestine. It's a strange one, because I just, one of the things that I find hateful about what's going on in Palestine is it seems that every 3 years or something there's another hideous escalation by the Israeli state. But I think there are some new kind of dynamics here. Like Gregor, I mean, I don't know how many protests I've been on with you over Palestine over the year. What's your take on the current ton of events?
Yeah, I think, it's very heartening to hear that there were Palestine flags on the demo today. And I do think Palestine is a question which always has and will continue to radicalise young thinkers and activists in Scotland. It's this fundamental historical injustice which continues to stain our 21st century and shame the international community. And I think for many people of a progressive bent, it's ideologically ruptural because the framing imposed by the mainstream media is so fundamentally incompatible with reality on the ground. So again, as we're well used to by now, the BBC will relentlessly peddle this myth of an exchange of hostilities between two mutually opposing sides, entirely abstracted from historical and legal context. And this type of narrative making conceals a conflict which could scarcely be more asymmetrical in terms of its resourcing, capacity, technological capability, and impact on the respective civilian populations. So again, we've seen airstrikes on the world's largest open-air prison in Gaza. And yeah, it's hard to watch. I think, Operation Cast Lead in 2008 was one of the real kind of radicalizing moments for me. And as you said, David, this, every few years you get this eruption of violence in Palestine. But I think the important thing to remember is that whilst the situation will receive international media attention at these moments, human rights violations, atrocities are a very regular weekly occurrence in occupied Palestinian territories. And this is where, the kind of abstract calls for peace are just very empty, because there is no stability, there is no peace for Palestinians at any point in time. But no, it's extremely difficult coverage to watch, as you say.
Yeah, no, it is. But I do also think, and it's something that people have been pointing out, and it's still, look, the Palestinian question from like a strategic point of view is extremely difficult because the Palestinians are in a very weakened position. It's not like South Africa where the black working class population outnumbered the white population by a factor of several times. I mean, I think there were only something like 3 million white South Africans at the time of the apartheid state. The difference now is, of course, you have this kind of a brutal apartheid regime, but that the populations are roughly equivalent. But in terms of like armed force, they're nowhere near equivalent because Israel is armed to the teeth and trained and funded by Western powers for whom their colony is essentially, it's a project of Western power fundamentally. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. And over recent years, we've had people, because I often have people say to me, even people who are kind of left wing, they'll say, why is the left so obsessed with this question, right? And the implication is, well, surely it has something to do with anti-Semitism. Some people have they've really convinced themselves of their own bullshit on this front. I think there are obvious reasons why Palestine is such an international symbol. It's the last standout example of that colonial project that otherwise collapsed in the 20th century under the force of revolutions. So, Rhodesia, so-called, is gone. Zimbabwe, the apartheid South Africa is gone. Lots of these examples of these types of states, of these kind of racial hierarchy type states have disappeared, but there's still one that's not only still on the go, it's thriving, it's achieving its aims in terms of the continual, gradual ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And almost everyone in Western politics treats it as you say, as a moral problem. These tribes have been fighting each other, forever. A totally fake history constructed around something which is very much a 20th and 21st century phenomenon. So I think there are obvious reasons why it appeals to people on that basis. Sara, see on that question of, this accusation that has been made. I mean, do you think, obviously in the last couple of years, pro-Palestine activists have been under enormous pressure. Do you think this is a bit of a moment where, it can be, we can claw back the right to protest and to speak out on this issue?
No, I certainly hope so. And I think you've got a coming together of a various set of circumstances, not just around the conflict itself, but also the wider picture around what's happening in Israel itself. I mean, obviously, Netanyahu is under immense pressure. He's gone through, 4 elections in 2 years, couldn't get a majority parliament together. He himself, and how many accusations of corruption charges is he up against as well? So Netanyahu is not in a particularly strong position. And I do wonder whether this is partly used to try and bolster support for him. But it's in a very, very divisive way, because the situation is different from 2014 in now that the attacks are happening within Israel, or Palestine 48, as it's often referred to as well, with these armed right-wing Israeli mobs going in and beating up people in their homes, dragging them out of their homes, beating them up on the street. We saw, of course, the appalling actions around the Al-Aqsa Mosque as well. And I think that it just feels a little bit different. And of course, now all of these images are getting broadcast around the world by social media, so we can see what's happening, because I think, as you've alluded to, Gregor's pointed out, the reporting from the British media, as a lot of the Western media, is so distorted, it's untrue. And if you just, it's like the Israeli army is obviously trying to create facts on the ground by basically trying to push back the Palestinians to such an extent as that they are pushed out either by building on their territories, the occupied territories, and creating a reality where Israel just pushes further and further into Palestine. And Western media and media in the UK is trying to create facts over the media waves by portraying it in a completely distorted, unequal fashion. And I just think there is now an opportunity, because of what's going on inside of Israel itself, I think, and the unpopularity amongst many Israelis of Netanyahu, but also what we see in that people are actually beginning to see what's going on the ground inside Israel, as well as what's going on with Gaza. There could be a chance to resurrect that. And I think the whole, going back, if you think about it, to when Corbyn was in power, and you had Margaret Hodge talking about how she felt really unsafe in the streets of Britain, and that it was a bit like the run-up to Hitler taking over Germany. I don't know if you remember that. I mean, it was absolutely, nonsensical, but actually really insulting. I thought that she could even draw that kind of comparison. And the idea was that people, Maureen Lipman, the broadcaster, saying, I'm going to go and live in Israel because that's the only place where Jewish people can feel safe. I do think it raises the question of, being able to ask about the state of Israel, which has always been part of the Zionist project, as actually it's the only place that Jews can live in safety on the world. Jewish people are always going to be the victims of punishments, of pogroms, etc., with real reason behind that. If we look historically, of course, of the oppression of Jewish people in history. But this idea that the Jewish state would offer them, sanctuary. I don't think when you're looking at images coming out of Israel, you can say that today. What does Israel actually mean? It's not just for the Palestinians. What does Israel mean for the Israelis? It means a perpetual state, a militarized state. It means habitual incursions into Gaza and bombing of innocent people. And now it means people being beaten up within your streets as well. So I don't know. I just hope it would open up a bigger question about what is going on with the state of Israel and the history of Palestine. But I mean, it's awful. I feel really distressed looking at the scenes coming out. I've seen dead children on various websites today. It's appalling. But what I do take hope from is this resilience, 7 decades of resilience, that it won't go away. And I think that's something that, whenever we feel really hopeless and demoralized in the West, it's about thinking about Palestine is the torch that continues you know, the flame that continues to burn, really, for all of us that are looking for justice in the world.
And I think, sorry, David, I think Sara raises a really important point there to connect it to the monstering of Corbyn and the weaponization of anti-Semitism. I think this is a crucial moment for the left in Britain, and if we accept this equivalence between pro-Palestine activism and anti-Semitism, then we risk narrowing the scope of public debate potentially forever. And this was an attempt to sanitize and domesticate a potential Corbyn-led British government, but also to prevent in future anyone with this politics and this worldview, which is out with the scope of the extreme centre, US-aligned foreign policy to ever achieve ascendancy in Britain. And for me, I think it's about time the left had a backbone on this stuff. The stuff which I find really infuriating is this kind of deferential, introspective, well maybe if they say that we're racist, then maybe we actually are racist and maybe we should go on unconscious bias training and so on. I think it's both an appalling spectacle, but especially in light of the fact that the fundamental parameters of the conflict are uncontestable. It's not like an intricate moral maze. And I do speak to people who are terrified of touching the question with a barge pole because it's constructed as so complex. It's not very complex. Israel has been in flagrant violation of international law in its occupation of Palestinian territory since 1967. It has aggressively been pursuing settlement an ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people in contravention of a list of UN Security Council resolutions as long as you're armed. And these are the liberal institutions of the global capitalist system who hold Israel in contempt. In the strongest possible terms. And simply acknowledging that factual reality tends to place you on the kind of political extreme in this country now, which is obviously wild. But I do think that the policy of appeasement of the Corbyn leadership did not work. There's no point at which they're going to accept your backsliding. I think you have to maintain a principled and correct position and stand up for yourself, I think, most fundamentally.
I totally agree with that. And as Sara says, the Zionist argument, and it must be said, because this is also a word that people have attempted to outlaw. I don't know why. I mean, it's a completely legitimate point of converse that you can't discuss history, of this question without discussing this idea. When the Zionist idea was first founded in the late 1900s, I was actually in a museum in Vienna, which of course one of the most important cities for the development of the Zionist movement. That was where Theodor Herzl was one of the leading theoreticians of the movement. And it was done in a mood that you can understand. Like I think that there was always an argument within progressive Jewish circles in Europe between, and it's a familiar argument for people who experience racism. It's the same argument in some senses that took place in the United States, in the African-American community. You always had those like Malcolm X, at least while he was in the Nation of Islam, who said, the only thing we can do is separate. It's a completely defensive and a racialist idea. We are incompatible with the white community. They will never accept us. The only thing to do is to separate into our own nation and defend ourselves with a state. Because you look around the world and the state, especially when you're in a persecuted racial minority, the state is always so terrifying to you. What if we had our own state? It makes a certain intuitive sense. There was always, of course, people in the African-American movement like the Black Panthers or more mainstream figures in the civil rights movement like Martin Luther King, who always said, no, the argument has to be a more radical one about changing society more broadly, collectively, across racial divides. There was always that in European Jewish communities as well. You had movements like the Bund, who were like a socialist movement, who said, no, Europe is my home. And I believe that was actually a Bund slogan, Europe is our home, right? Like, we're not leaving, we're not being chased away. But it wasn't a progressive idea, the Zionist idea, but you could understand the impulses that led to it, the feelings of social isolation and weakness that led to it. That's one thing, right? That's not what's going on in Israel. The reality after 100 years, or not 100 years after the founding of the state, but in the 21st century, the reality is brutal racism. And that ideology has changed. It's changed from one that was a diaspora ideology of intellectuals who wanted a way out of oppression. It's changed from that into the ideological justification of a colonial state that asserts the racial superiority of the Jewish population in law. That is a completely different proposition from what was imagined abstractly in Europe. So yeah, and I agree, Gregor. It's one of the most morally black and white questions on the earth today. I don't think I can take it if I hear another BBC News report talking about how complex the situation in Palestine is. Least complex. There are a lot of complex things in the world. This isn't that complex. So no, I agree. And the other thing that was alluded to was, I think, Sara, by yourself, is there is a change in the dynamics around the situation in Israel itself. So now the Palestinian parts of the Palestinian population who don't live in the West Bank or in Gaza, but within the territory of actually existing Israel, are being persecuted and are fighting back in a kind of an unprecedented way. And it's really interesting that the Israeli state's response to that is to bomb Gaza, because they don't want that. What they want is a conflict with Hamas, where Hamas is isolated from other Palestinian forces. They're more happy with that than with open a civil rights movement on the streets of Israel as well. So there's a hope that a different dynamic can emerge there and kind of break the deadlock on this issue. But I totally agree. If you hope for that, it's not enough. You actually need to stand up and say, no, we have every right to discuss this. In a grim way, the one thing I always think about Palestine is this ends dramatically, right? One way or the other, right? I don't even want to think about what the successful creation of the final kind of settlement of this colonial regime would be. What would that even look like? The entire Palestinian population thrown into global diaspora? It doesn't bear thinking about. But that or a just settlement is what we're looking at. If you look at the changes of demographics across that territory, that's actually what we're looking at. History's not going to look kindly on people who are going around saying it's complex and so on. So yeah, I think there's still scope there for hope, and like the Palestinian people are demonstrating.
I think when you're just talking about how is it going to get resolved ultimately, I think it's always going to be resolved. It's not going to get resolved between those Palestine and Israel itself. And the best chance probably that we've had recently was with the Arab Spring 10 years ago. With those uprisings, with Palestinian flags being flown, it's a very central demand actually to the Arab Spring as well. And I think probably, I would imagine that's what we're looking for as well. But I just think the continuation, we're not in that period. We don't think at the moment. These things can change very quickly, of course. But I think just what's really important for, wherever we find ourselves, that the supporters of Palestine and Justice for Palestine will make sure that we are as visible and out on the streets as possible in our support, because I think that is just absolutely essential. And those images do go back to Palestine. And just to know that flame that torch is being kept alight outside of the region itself, I think it's crucial.
Yeah, you often hear, people saying, you know, the Arab Spring as a project ended in disaster, which it did, right? I mean, there's no question that it ended in, you know, bloodbaths in Libya and Syria and so on, and it was repressed in general, you know, with the counter-revolution in Egypt and so on. Still, though, it's remarkable because that's quite an old kind of socialist argument that you need the wider array of the working class, basically the working class masses of countries like Egypt in particular, which of course borders Palestine and Israel, to be that decisive force that can change the dynamic. You know, and on the one hand, yeah, okay, it was beaten back, but it also happened. That, I mean, there was also a moment there where the Arab working class were united in a common project that united contempt for domestic elites, as well as, you know, the overarching force of kind of Western, the architecture of imperialism in that part of the world, and that included Israel. So that is a real formula. Like, we've actually seen it come into play. Sorry, you're going to come in there, Gregor.
Yeah, I think, I don't think, you know, thinking optimistically, I don't think this is a situation which can persist indefinitely. I think you're quite right, David, to say that this is a holdout in terms of formal, legally inscribed racist colonial settler state. Certainly has no place in the 21st century, but I can't imagine that it will continue indefinitely. And I think once the tide starts to turn, there's going to be a lot of folk that start to look really silly in terms of their support for this project. I do think any solution which is reached has to involve the right to return of Palestinian refugees. And what you were talking about, David, in terms of the scattering of Palestinian diaspora, we have to remember that this has happened throughout the 20th century and into our own century. There are more registered Palestinian refugees than there are people in Scotland. And there are expected to be at least another 1.5 million, which are unregistered descendants of original refugees. So there has to be a settlement which allows those people to go home and rebuild a sense of home and community if they do want to. And yeah, you know, there has to be recognition of the right of the Palestinian people to have true independence and sovereignty in terms of their their civic and political lives. But I do think when the tide starts to turn, things could change very quickly. And whilst the contribution may feel small, I think organising, you know, support for boycott, divestment and sanctions, sending delegations of trade unionists and progressive people to Palestine, creating art and culture and political messaging in support of the Palestinian people. This stuff does matter. It does matter.
Yeah, and I'm kind of going to make a segue from sort of big global and profound questions into the Scottish scene, which, you know, after the elections is a bit staid and so on. But I mean, there are interesting relationships between Scotland and these bigger questions. So yesterday on our last election show, I asserted, and I was rebuffed by an SNP councillor in Glasgow, Graham Campbell, who said Scotland can't do anything. We don't have foreign policy powers to help the Palestinians. It seems totally obvious to me that in the Queen's speech, you know, you had one of the things was to ban public sector bodies from engaging in boycott, divestment, and sanctions, right? But that did make me think, oh yeah, so like there's not a lot that goes on of that in Britain, right? There is some, but I thought, so well, that kind of shows that that's not true. Like there is stuff that could be going on right now. The statements that came from the SNP on this question, particularly from Alan Smith, were very strong. Like they were saying things like I mean, they're not strong, they're weak in compared to the scale of the problem, but they are strong by historical standards of the SNP. The SNP said, oh, well, the UK state should consider, you know, reducing its diplomatic contact with Israel and look at, boycotting goods from settler communities. And I thought, yeah, that's good, but you could do that now. There's a consulate in Edinburgh, right? You could refuse to recognise that today. We could be talking about, and look, I don't even know how much trade is done between public sector, procurement bodies and Israeli settlements right now. But what a message it would be to say, as it happens, we're rolling out this rule on procurement that we won't buy anything that's produced in one of these illegal settlements. I mean, what a message that would send just to even say that. So there are things going on now, but and this kind of dovetails with what happened today down at Kenmure Street. The Nicola Sturgeon put out a statement saying, nothing to do with me, right? This was the Home Office. This is nothing to do with me, despite the fact that I counted 12 Police Scotland riot vans down there, and this couldn't happen without Police Scotland. We're still in this bind where the SNP, who of course returned 64 seats in the recent election, they're in this position to say everything that is bad that's happening is happening because of Westminster, right? And of course, yeah, that's where a lot of these strategies are being cooked up, whether it's Palestine, whether it's the hostile environment, whether it's attacks on the right to protest, whether it's the anti-working class policies that are sure to start already rolling out in response to the economic crisis off the back of the pandemic. Yes, it's true, all this stuff is originating in Westminster, but you also have a British political establishment in Scotland who want to remain friends with the business community, who want to remain friends with, the international rules-based order, so-called, that is, the same forces that defend the Israeli state and talk up how complex it all is. They want to keep these friends. So they're going to continue to behave in this kind of way. Was that a bit grim for you, Gregor? I mean, whatever else you might say about the elections, I mean, I didn't really feel annoyed about the outcome. It was still, I suppose, it's an improvement on what's going down on Westminster. But I also did just think, like, God, here we go, another 5 years of this equivocal shit, basically.
Yeah, I think the fear of many of us that were involved in DREF campaign in the run-up to 2014 is that the collapse of the independence movement into big tent electoralism would procure this generational hegemony for the SNP, and that is what has eventuated. And I think with every election cycle, the SNP leadership have become more cynical, and I think its voters have become less enthused in general, and expectations have been lowered in terms of what the SNP will do in government. And I think we live in a really strange time. I think Scottish politics are hallucinatory in the sense that the next referendum is forever over the horizon. It's just forever round the bend. And we have kind of suspended in thin air these kind of contradictions in the SNP's economic policy and prospectus for an independent Scotland. This perpetual dynamic of the SNP as a government in opposition allows them to straddle these contradictions in a really anachronous way. So SNP economic policy is orthodox in the extreme, yet they promise transformation. And this is a lie. It's a deceit. You cannot build a better Scotland, a Nordic Scotland, a social democratic Scotland with the structure of high finance, banks, of big capital interests which predominate in this country. You can't do it on the basis of sterlingization and a monetary union where you have no central bank, no control over the levers of monetary and fiscal policy. You can't rebuild or reindustrialize Scotland on that basis. So, the SNP is straddling these contradictions. It's trying to have its cake and eat it. It's been trying to woo elite votes while still promising change to working people. I think a lot of folk are pretty sick of it. So it did feel pretty anticlimactic, the election. I was voting in Glasgow South Side, and I voted alongside 146 other citizens for Greg Energy Advisor, who is just kind of like a mad guy, but who wanted to renationalize the energy network and reduce utility bills. And he spoke about fuel poverty. And I was like, grand, that's for me. And then like pretty much everyone I know voted kind of Green on the list. And, you know, I think, you know, the Greens have made some small gains and they have hegemonized the young professional managerial class, but I think they are so limited culturally in their appeal to working people, and that I'm not sure how much bigger they can grow. Plus, I'm quite cynical by now of their role with respect to SNP. I don't think they're a true opposition. They're certainly not going to hold the SNP to account, and they're probably just going to try and maximise support through marginally tinkering with SNP policy in the realm of ecology and perhaps in other areas.
Sara, I'm really interested to hear your take on this because, I mean, you're not an outsider because, as you've already said, you lived here in the 90s and so on. Did you live down south for a time? I don't actually even know your sort of biography in this respect.
I've lived in lots of different places, but yes, so 20 years ago, in my 20s, I stayed in Glasgow. That's where I spent my 20s. And it's just 3 years ago, came back up to Edinburgh this time.
So you would have been here in the 90s before when the SNP they were kind of on the up in the sense, you know, they started to kind of occupy a certain niche, though of course it was the Scottish Parliament that gave them the opportunity proper to surge. But in the 90s, I mean, I remember in the 90s, I asked my dad who the SNP were. He's now a nationalist. He's now a member of the SNP. But he just said, because he was a Labour guy and, you know, they laughed at the SNP. He was like, bunch of weirdos. You know what I mean? It's like a bunch of folk in kilts doing little dances, little ceilidhs. I think he used to say that they were just like the Lib Dems in kilts. I never heard the Tartan Tory line from him. I think he had too much contempt for them to describe them as Tories. They were just liberals in kilts. You know what I mean? It was they were a silly party. He's now, you know, absolutely signed up, as many former Labour Party people are, partly out of disgust over things like the Iraq War and so on. I mean, I think for a lot of people, they just felt, I can't keep voting for this. But anyway, so in the 90s, you know, this was still a baby project. And then you returned, you know, 3 years ago to find that it had exploded to monstrous proportions and completely guzzled up Scottish politics. So what was your kind of take on the election?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite amazing, isn't it, that transformation over 20 years and that sort of, the Tories and this, and people just not taken seriously in the 90s. I don't have much recollection of them. They weren't really there, and now they're fully dominating the scene. I mean, going back to what you said, Gregor, you used the word hallucinatory, and I've been using the word chimera politics. This is my own little word. It's like that illusion of a hope that is just never going to be fulfilled, but also a chimera in the sense of a scientific meaning of you've got these really, you know, of having different DNA in the same body. We've now got such broad church, parties. And I think this is true for Labour down south as well. It is for SNP up here. There's such broad electoral projects, really, broad churches pulling in loads of people. That really, if those organisations and parties had any links and roots into communities, they wouldn't be, you know, these different wings wouldn't be in the same organisation. They would be different political organisations pursuing their ends to best to meet the needs of the people that they were trying to serve. So you've got these really, really broad electoral projects. Really, they don't really have the links, even though of course there's a mass membership base and there was under Corbyn, but the real links to the communities, workplaces is really not there in the sense that it might have been in the past. And, you know, it's just this idea of in the Independence Party. I mean, you made the point, I think, David, that in the acceptance speech, Nicola Sturgeon's acceptance speech, she didn't even mention the word independence. I mean, isn't this the whole point? If I'm talking about independence, that wasn't just, you know, oh, I forgot. It was a deliberate omission to mention that word. And it's like the whole strategy around what she's doing at the moment. There's a strategy, it seems to be, of hand-wringing is what I would call it, is that we can't do anything about it. And you know, if you think about the sort of, when you go into managerial speak and they talk about, you know, you need to present yourself as the person you want to be, project yourself as the person you want other people to see you as. If you take that into a political realm, I would expect at this point, following a pandemic, that the SNP would be presenting itself as the party that is fit to lead in an independent Scotland, and showing that and actually trying to prove that in some of the actions that it could be taken, whether it be around Palestine, whether it be around cuts to council budgets, actually putting themselves out there. They're doing nothing. They just seem to be rolling back and sort of shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, you know, there's not anything we can do about it. It doesn't seem to match up to this idea of a country that's going to stand on its own feet and make its own decisions, when this is kind of the hand-wringing that's going on at the moment. So it's a strange one. You know, I was really expecting, I didn't know what way the election would go, and the campaigning particularly. I either thought that there would be really strong messaging about we've been through a pandemic, can't go back to that, we need to have a different vision of a different future as an independent nation, or it was going to be really understated and we're not promising very much at all. And it seemed to be the latter case, the softly, you know, let's not talk about independence too much. I don't really know what the end game is there, really, but it doesn't convince me that actually existing independence is the end game. I don't know. It's a bit strange. I don't know what other people think about it, but I'm not convinced.
I have wondered about this, and it's very hard to come to my general feeling is I don't think there's going to be a referendum even in this Parliament. I think that what's going to happen is there's going to be a request for a Section 30 order. It's either going to be rebuffed or it's going to be negotiated to death by the UK government, and all kinds of, you know, silly, you know, things about, well, you need to get over 65% of the vote or something. I mean, we've had referendums in Britain like that, you know, 2/3 vote is, you know, would secure independence, or confirmatory vote, or a 3-option referendum, at which point whoever's in charge of the SNP will just need to say, we can't do this. This isn't an independence referendum. And then the Tory government can just say, well, we offered it to you and you said no, right? I mean, there's a lot of tactics that the central government can actually deploy to deal with this. It's not just a question of, well, they say yes or they say no. There's a lot of ways to kick the can endlessly down the road. And there's going to be a faction of both the Tories and the SNP for whom can kicking is a really good idea, right? I mean, this is part of the problem. It's a bit like, do you remember that theorist in the Social Democratic Party that Rosa Luxemburg debated with Bernstein, was it? Who said, you know, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, right? And what he was doing was providing a kind of aesthetic for the social democracy that we've become so used to, you know, this kind of, well, we're endlessly, you know, moving towards the great day, but the great day will never come, which is a very good kind of electoral strategy, at least until it completely wears everyone out. I sort of wonder if the SNP is becoming the Stronger for Scotland party rather than the Independence Party. It's a party that always has independence on its menu, it always believes in it. In the same way, I mean, we've seen this happen before in Ireland. You have Fianna Fáil, the Eamon de Valera's party, which was the Republican Party, the pro-independence party that wanted to reclaim the Northern Irish counties and you know, wanted to proclaim the Republic and so on. Fianna Fáil became this party of institutional power, and they couldn't get chucked out by anyone. But they were always just haggling with, you know, diplomats about the North. There was never a real drive towards independence. So this is a real thing that happens. And this thing lives as well in Quebec today, where you have a nationalist party, a kind of centre-right national party, which is in favour of independence in theory, but not really. Right? It's mostly just about kind of Quebec identity and Quebec rights and in a Canadian setting. I wonder how far down the road the SNP has now travelled to being this kind of nationalist party. But I mean, I hate this phrase. You know, it gets very overused in kind of Western popular culture now. Gaslighting. You know what I mean? I do sometimes feel like we're being, you know what I mean? Like we're having our brains played with a bit here. You know, it was only a few months ago you had people like Ian Blackford, the Westminster leader of the SNP, and Mike Russell, the Constitution Secretary, saying, well, we're going to have a referendum in 2021. You know, it's been perpetually 6 months away for as long as I can remember. And you do wonder, you know, the psychology that allows that to keep going. You know, they use our hope against us in a way, which is quite sort of creepy. Any final thoughts on that, Gregor? Just to kind of, you know, end it on maybe a slightly more upbeat note. He doesn't have one.
I don't know how I go from there to upbeat. You've handed me a dodgy set of cards there. But I do fundamentally agree. I mean, some of this stuff is just kind of symptoms of decline of the independence movement and its kind of dissolution into mythology. And there's so much about the SNP government which is mythologized. I mean, Sturgeon's leadership is centrist, managerial, technocratic style over substance, and yet there's an army of social media, quote unquote activists who are doing this girl boss Sturgeon thing. Investing in her cultural capital and reproducing it, and so on. And I think actually the Salmond affair has ended up playing out quite well for Nicola. And it's masked the fact that she has presided over a disastrous response to COVID, where more than 3,000 of our elderly citizens perished in corporate care homes around the country. And we're subject to, the decision to send elderly patients back from hospital without COVID tests and clarification of their status in terms of COVID. And I do think accountability in this regard is severely lacking. That's not becoming more optimistic, is it?
I have an optimistic note. I have one, right? Which is, look, I think over the next few years, we're going to see, it's going to be very hard to meter the changes that take place in society. You're going to see a very significant social and economic restructuring. What impact does that have on kind of this national consciousness that we have, which is very unusual, which is a kind of like left populist inflected national consciousness? And yeah, look, it's full of it's full of like as you say, kind of hallucinations about, like, I know lots of people who think that the Saltire flag is a left-wing flag. Like they do you know what I mean? They see that national imagery as representing something truly dissident, truly kind of rebellious, and so on. Is there a lot of illusion built into that? Yeah, but that's the nature of ideology, right? That's the nature of ideology in a capitalist society. So many people have projected a rebellious image onto things like Christianity or Islam, or, do you know what I mean, New Age religion, or, and indeed national consciousness. There are lots of countries in the world where people think that their country is inherently the kind of like freedom country. Do you know what I mean? It's not a kind of unknown thing. That's how ideology works as a carrier of ideas. I think it will still be interesting to see how the changing circumstances impact on that. Once you get, mass unemployment in certain parts of the economy, which is likely given the extent of changes prompted by the kind of COVID economy. So things like Amazon savaging the high streets, for example. When a method is finally found to deal with the debts that have been built up through money printing in the last year, right? And whoever has to bear that on their shoulders, and I think we all know who that's going to be, when that stuff starts to hit, when those changes start to take place, and in the middle of that, the Scottish government requests a a referendum, and at best they're given kind of gerrymandering, right? It will be interesting to see what the popular response to that is all I'm saying. And it could well surprise everyone. Or, you know, it could be managed to death by the SNP. They're very good at doing that. But I do just still think, you know, there's only so much you can kick. Even though there's kind of more of a subdued mood in the independence movement, I still think to hundreds of thousands of people, it's a real question. It's a real proposition. So we'll just have to see how those kind of tensions metabolize themselves.
I do think, like any crisis within our social system, economic system, the COVID pandemic has revealed in stark clarity certain key dynamics which power our society, and I think they've kind of laid them bare for a lot of people. So I think the question of skilled and unskilled labor, and the ideology of meritocracy, which supports the vast inequality in wealth and earnings in our economy, for instance, that has been dismantled in the course of the pandemic. Similarly, neoliberal privatization of public services, the marketization of our healthcare system, commodification of social care, these have been revealed to be murderous policies. That's also important. And I think most profoundly, the just erosion of the state and the capacity of the state to respond to this kind of global, health catastrophe, how slow and lacking in agility and coordinating capacity it was, I think is really important. The question for me is, are we able to make sure that these revelations have political articulation and have political force post-COVID? Because there is a dynamic whereby when we finally get out of this pandemic or return to some form of normality, you know, the forces in power will get some kind of boost through the success of the vaccination program and so on. But I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that there's political memory at play here, and we don't forget the anger of the mismanagement and the effective sacrifice of tens of thousands of people in this country on the altar of economic continuity and capital interests and so on.
Thanks very much for those last ruminations, Gregor, and thanks very much to both of you, Sara and Gregor, for coming on ConterCast today. I hope you've enjoyed it. And next week or perhaps the week after, we'll have to see. We'll see the glorious return of Cat Boys. We've been cooking up some ideas for shows and guests, and I hope regular listeners are excited by what we've got coming up. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon, folks.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.